Over to you, Susan.
Good morning, everybody. That's everybody in North America, Canada, and good afternoon to us on the beautiful continent. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this conversation, and I have the delight because I'm doing this out of my home country of Uganda, the Pearl of Africa. But I know that we have a lot of people joining all from the continent, and it's always great to talk about trade. So today we have a beautiful lineup. I don't know if we can call it beautiful. They're all beautiful gentlemen, but the conversation is going to be beautiful, and it's going to be lovely to hear various viewpoints on this important topic of trade. I'll send it back to Gareth to do the formal intro, but we are delighted that you've taken some time to sit with us today to have this conversation.
Susan Amolindwa, Vice President, usually in Ottawa, but joining us this morning and this afternoon from Uganda. Thank you so much. I'd like to welcome Parliamentary Secretary MP Rob Oliphant, who's with us, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and then our incredible panel, originally Vera Songwe, but today represented by Dr. Stephen Kuringi, joining us from the United Nations Economic Commission on Africa, Fred McMahon, who's the head of the Economic Freedom of the World Index at the Fraser Institute in Toronto, and then over in Accra, Sebastian Spiergarber, former chair of the chamber and currently special envoy to the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is an exciting topic, the theme of Canada as a trusted partner and arbiter in the furthering of the African Continental Free Trade Area, an agreement to which Canada played a significant role in terms of the formulation and ultimate acceptance by all member states of the African Union. Well, at the forefront of much of the leadership on the Africa file, in addition to his work around the world, MP Rob Oliphant is joining us this morning as well. No stranger to those who are regular attendees of chamber events. MP Rob Oliphant is certainly a veteran and has spent a lot of time on the continent, on the ground, handling some of the big major opportunities that currently exist. We know that Prime Minister Trudeau has made a commitment, and it's to the furthering of not only an Africa strategy currently underway, but specifically in the context of support for AFCTFA, with specific reference as well to infrastructure, among other opportunities. MP Rob Oliphant, always a privilege to have you from all of us here at the Chamber. I could think of no better person this morning to open up a session of such importance, given the economic potential and prospects for a market of 1.3 billion people in what is the world's biggest free trade area by the number of countries measured. Thank you for all your government has done. Thank you for what you have done. And the floor is yours, MP Rob Oliphant.
Thank you very much, Gareth. Just want to check my sound is okay.
Excellent.
I've had technical difficulties this morning. Ottawa is not an easy place to be in these days. However, I know I'm also not in the Conservative caucus meeting today, which is going to be the hardest place in Ottawa right now. For those you who know what's going on in Canada, that'll be an interesting place. But good morning, and thank you to all of you for being here. And thank you for that kind introduction, Gareth. And congratulations to you and your team at the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business. I have been a friend of the Chamber for many years. In the last couple of years, the Chamber has grown both in impact as well as in importance to both the African continent and the countries therein, as well as to Canada. And we recognize that wins in Africa are wins in Canada, and we are recognizing that our futures, our prosperity, our well-being are intimately bound together. And Prime Minister Trudeau has indicated that very clearly. That has to do with business and investment, as well as all of the other aspects of Canadian interests in Africa. I want to begin by acknowledging that although we are gathering virtually, I happen today to be gathering and joining you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I'm pleased to connect with you in the various territories that you are speaking in today. It's an honor for me to join with you more formally to discuss Canada's role in what we understand as a trusted third party for the long-term prosperity in the context of realizing the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AFC FTA. Supporting Africa's future growth and prosperity as a trusted partner is not just an abstract goal for the Government of Canada, but it's our priority. And it is a priority both on the continued growth of ourselves as a trusted partner. We don't take that for granted. We know we need to build on that constantly and encourage Canadians to recognize our role as a trusted partner, but also the future growth and prosperity uniquely of Africa. With its 54 signatories now, the AFC FTA is a significant achievement. I've watched it grow and become an increasing reality. It represents an important opportunity for Africa and its trading partners to develop a continent-wide, rules-based trade and investment environment, a predictable, dependable environment for that kind of work. Canada sees the African Continental Free Trade Area and intra-African trade as one of the key future drivers of the African economies across the continent, particularly as we together, but particularly you in Africa, recover from the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic. It's been real. It has affected our countries differently, but it has affected certainty and predictability when it comes to business, and we're all concerned about how we grow out of that. The AFC FTA can also help establish, I think, a tremendous degree of stability and predictability across the region, enabling it to attract greater trade and investment from, and therefore encouragement from, global partners around the world. That's why since 2003, Canada has supported African Trade Policy Center at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. This organization has played a key role in the development and negotiation of the AFC FTA, and we were proud to contribute to it financially and in other ways. It's also why Canada has recently approved additional funding of over $15 million for over 5 years to support the AFC FTA implementation, including support for key activities that focus on inclusive trade, job creation, and climate action. Canada, as we all know, is a free trade nation. We believe that we do better when trade is free and predictable in a rules-based international order. And we believe that this agreement will create an enabling environment over the long term for Canadian firms doing business in Africa. It will promote investment in Africa. And drawing from our own experience, and recognizing also that every African challenge deserves and demands an African solution, we hope that this agreement will help define African business and trade solutions based on the principles you've agreed to, which is regional integration and rules-based trade, the free flow of goods, and free flow of capital and labor. For Canada and Canadian businesses and Canadians, this agreement offers a made in Africa opportunity for more labor-intensive, value-added production in key sectors. And we know what those are. We know that they're agro-processing, their infrastructure, their energy, clean technology, the things that we have been working on together for decades. Our commitment is clear, and we've stated it publicly. And Canada's Minister of International Trade and Export Promotion Small Business, Mary Ng, has received a mandate from our Prime Minister to develop a strategy for economic cooperation across Africa. And that includes support for the AFC FTA and its implementation, facilitating increased investment in infrastructure, expanding our partnerships in research and innovation with universities and other organizations in the continent. We look forward to discussing this strategy with Canadian businesses and with the Chamber and your members in the coming months. As I said, we don't take our role as a trusted third party for granted. This is about Canada's engagement in a made in Africa for Africa solution. Later this month, Mary Ng will participate in the first ever virtual trade mission of Canadian women entrepreneurs in Botswana, Senegal, South Africa, and Cote d'Ivoire, organized by Global Affairs Canada in collaboration with this chamber. It'll be on renewables and the ICT sectors. I look forward to the outcome of this mission. I think I want to sneak into it for at least part of it, which I have no doubt will further strengthen our trade engagement with African partners. So in closing, let me just reiterate that Canada looks forward to a closer, stronger, just, equal relationship with our African counterparts to strengthen and build the prosperity of both our countries, both our continents and all our countries. Our trade and investment strategy includes Africa. We're there. We want to grow with you. Bring to us your questions, your concerns, your ideas, and your thoughts, and we will engage. Thank you for this webinar event, and I look forward to a greater relationship and more participation and the outcomes of today's meeting as well. Thanks, Gareth.
Honourable Member Rob Oliphant, thank you so much. And as a chamber, may I say on behalf of our board and our members, what a privilege it is to have this partnership and to work closely alongside yourself and the ministers, including Minister Mary Ng, on the upcoming events and the file thus far and a number of events we've had. I believe, you know, this just on AFCTFA is one of the 5 events we've held in the context of around 60 just during this pandemic period. And it's fantastic to see the results, the action and the activity continue in full force. Well, we've got an incredible panel lined up today, and I want to thank each of our panelists. I want to thank Global Affairs Canada, with whom we've co-curated this program as a partner. And I want to also give special recognition to all of those across the African continent joining us through the Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity, an absolutely phenomenal group of think tanks, really recognizing the importance of Canada, Canadian expertise, both public sector, private sector, and otherwise. So thank you so much for being on the call with us. It's a privilege to have you. Our speakers are going to follow in the order as mentioned. Dr. Karingi will begin, joining us from Addis Ababa, followed by Fred McMahon, and then Sebastian Spiergarber. By way of a quick introduction of our panelists, I do know that each of you have received the information ahead of this event. Dr. Karingi is Director for Regional Integration and Trade at the UN Economic Commission on Africa, and he's been focused on issues for several years. Before he joined in 2004, he was a senior analyst and head of macroeconomics at the Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research, a think tank based in Kenya. Fred McMahon joins us from the currently top-rated policy think tank in Canada, as measured, I believe, by the University of Pennsylvania each year in their report of 8,000 policy groups worldwide. Fred is the resident fellow and holder of the Dr. Michael A. Walker Chair in Economic Freedom, and has been leading on this report, working with over 100 think tanks around the world on this annual index. And Fred is well known on the African continent. I know several joining us from places like Malawi, Burundi, South Africa, have all had the privilege of working with Fred in advancing free trade and open markets. And then Sebastian Spiergarber, our Special Trade and Investment Envoy of the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business to the AFCTFA Secretariat in Accra, also former chair of the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business, who's overseen the massive growth and success to which Dr. MP Rob Oliphant so kindly alluded in his remarks just a moment ago. Without further ado, Dr. Karingi, thank you so much for joining us from Addis Ababa. And to begin the conversation, I'll hand over to you, and do feel free to hit screen share for those slides. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. First of all, let me say hi to everyone. I don't know whether I'm able to, okay. Is it able to, oh, there. And maybe I minimize this. So first of all, thank you so much, Honorable MP Rob. I think you have actually said a lot what I was going to say to introduce myself. So I'm going to skip the part about the Africa Trade Policy Center, because clearly without the generosity of the Canadian people, we would not have been able to provide the kind of support that we've been providing to the work of the African member states on international trade and also on regional trade. So my presentation, I decided to call it AFCFTA, a case of all hands on deck and all on board. And I think some of the, you will see why I'm talking about all hands on deck and all on board. Very quickly, let me talk about, I'm going to talk about the update. So where are we with the agreement? I think it's good to see that we have colleagues from Accra who will be able to give even more. Now, I will also touch on why the AFCFTA is potentially transformative. And I think this is going to be important because I'm also going to take a minute to indicate some of the opportunities that are there for Canadian business, Canadian investors. Of course, I'm imagining that these opportunities are going to be opportunities that actually create value chains within the continent and also between Canada and Africa in the context of the global value chain. And then I'll talk a bit about the support that the ECA is providing to the AFCFTA. I think this is important because it contextualizes the whole idea of why we should be inclusive and why we should have everyone on board. And also we have to be mindful of the future. So on the updates, I think the Honorable Rob has actually said where we are in terms of the signatories and the ratification. We're actually doing quite well. We have a good number of countries that have, a majority of the countries have ratified the agreement. And the few that have signed and they have not ratified, I am aware a lot of them are actually working hard, getting support from the AFCFTA Secretariat, and also with the support with institutions like ours to complement the efforts of the Secretariat to get as many countries as possible to ratify, because of course we would want to have the whole continent being state parties to the agreement. Now, of course, one of the things that we tell countries is if you are a state party, there are quite a good number of benefits. And I think for the Canadians, as we have heard, you're a trading nation, you're pro-free trade, of course, inclusive free trade. There are benefits that you get by being a state party. You'll be able to get the beauty of the big market that the AFCFTA is going to build. And you'll also be able to deal with some of the NTBs in a harmonized way. When it comes to dealing with the issues of standards and regulations, it's going to be harmonization, and this harmonization is good for business because it minimizes the costs that the businesses have got to go through. And of course, you also get additional technical assistance and also capacity building support, because if you're a state party, it means that most likely you have a strategy of how you're going to get benefits from the AFCFTA. And you are able to talk to within government and to the private sector to be able to figure out how to support the initiatives that would allow you to be able to benefit from the agreement. So basically, we think this is an important message that we should continue to give, especially for the business people who are here. I think when you engage with the chambers of commerce in the continent, I think it's always good to hammer this message, because it's good for business for all countries within the continent to be state parties to the agreement. Now, where are we? Something significant happened last week, and I think you may have seen it in the press, that 87.7% of the tariff lines have agreed rules of origin. And as you saw in the statement that was issued by the Minister of Trade of South Africa and His Excellency Wamkele, there was an agreement that we should start trading with these rules of origin that have been agreed. I think that was a very significant decision that was made, in the sense that we should be able to start seeing the flow of shipments within the continent because of this quantum of tariff lines where they are agreed rules of origin. Of course, countries are working very hard in terms of making their offers. We had last week when the ministers met, the 44 tariff offers have actually been made, and the ministers actually asked for an acceleration for the conclusion of the verification of these offers. In the area of protocol and trading services, you're familiar that there are 5 priority services that are going to be opened up. These create opportunities for African businesses and those who would want to bring FDI to Africa to take advantage of this. And already the Secretariat has received 46 initial offers of commitment under the services. And the phase 2 issues, which are very important to the functioning of the AFCFTA in an optimal manner, the ministers were also able to give guidance on the kinds of things they would want to see accelerated within the next 24 months, so that even as we start trading and even as we conclude the trading services negotiations this year, it will be possible for that acceleration to also benefit from having a harmonized investment protocol, and also a situation whereby African entrepreneurs would actually be able to be confident about the intellectual property rights, and also to operate in a competition policy regime that is welcoming to everybody and that is fair. Now, in terms of why the AFCFTA is important, I think we have said this before. If you look at to the left of the screen, our total trade as a continent, most of it is with the rest of the world, and only about between 15 and 18% is intra-African. Now, it's not that Africa does not want to trade with the rest of the world. Of course, Africa wants to trade with the rest of the world. The problem is, even though 85% of the trade with the rest of the world is so significant, it's 85%, Africa constitutes only 3% of the global trade. And there is an explanation to this. The explanation, actually, you see it to the right-hand side because most of what Africa trades with the rest of the world, it so happens to be commodities, what we call forward integration. And if you're in a value chain and you're forward integrated, chances are you are trading more on commodities, raw materials, without any much value added. But within the continent, most of the trade that takes place within the continent, intra-African, most of it is actually value added. So the AFCFTA offers a platform where this 45% industrial value added trade that is taking place within the continent can actually grow further and then create opportunities for backward integration within the continent. And that will facilitate a deeper regional value chains and, of course, much more competitive integration of the continent into the global value chains. And this is a good reason why we need to have all hands on deck in terms of the AFCFTA. Now, so we have actually done some analysis. The Honorable MP did talk about agri-food. I've talked about services. I've talked about industry. So basically what we have done here at the Economic Commission for Africa, we've looked at the modalities as they have been agreed by the negotiators, or rather the state parties of the AFCFTA and those who have signed. And then we have asked the question, where would we be if we implemented the agreement faithfully, vis-a-vis where we would have been if we did not have the implementation of the agreement. So, of course, we know that there is a time between the start of the implementation and a period for the tariff phase down. So we have done a simulation that looks about up to 2045 where we would be. And what we see, there's actually going to be significant growth in agri-food. Today, a lot of agri-food trade within the continent is very low. There's going to be growth in terms of intra-African trading services, and also in terms of industry. Now, so these are some of the opportunities that the AFCFTA provide almost immediately if we start trading. And you can actually see what in this infographic that in the area of industry, you are going to witness growth in the pharmaceutical products, vehicles and transport equipment, and other manufactured products. And we know these are good for sustainable economic growth. Now, so what we have done recently is actually to take a deeper dive onto the question: if you implement the AFCFTA, And you have other trade that I have indicated that it is going to happen in terms of the growth of intra-African trade. How are you going to make it happen? And so what we did, we basically looked at the corridors that exist today in terms of rail, truck, maritime, and also in terms of the aviation equipment that is available. And we found that if you implement the AFCFTA by the date which I showed you, Africa will require a significant amount of additional trucks, rail wagons, vessels, aircrafts, for the continent to be able to trade. Now, as you can see, you can put a dollar value to each of these items, and you can also put a face value in terms of the number of human beings that you need to operate this equipment and also to build the stock within which they'll be moving on. And this in itself shows the opportunity that opening up transport services, which is one of the priority sectors, the kinds of things that can happen if we were to implement the AFCFTA. So those of us who are here and would want to come and invest in terms of production of these trucks, production of the rolling stock, here are some numbers that should be of interest to you. Now, quickly, very quickly, what is it that we are doing as the ECA? Now, again, I want to say that Canada has actually been very, very helpful in terms of the work that we've been able to do as ECA. We are able to generate knowledge, which informs a lot of the work that is happening under the AFCFTA. We are also able to look at cross-cutting issues, and I'm going to come to this issue again, because we know we do not trade for trade's sake. We want to have trade that is inclusive and also that is sustainable. And the other things is we want to make sure that everybody's voice is heard. And so we also have a lot of stakeholder engagement. We are doing this at the moment by complementing the work of the AFCFTA Secretariat in terms of working with countries as they develop their national strategies. All of you are also familiar with the regional economic communities. We also work with the regional economic communities so that they also have regional strategies in terms of the implementation of the AFCFTA. Now, I'm talking to the private sector, people who are here. So one of the other things that we have done as ECA, and we are doing this in the context of a project that is supported by the European Union on these strategies development, is we ask the question, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, everybody would be asking, especially in the private sector, they would want to be able to say that the AFCFTA delivered what it promised. So we are also developing an instrument that will be used by the private sector to give feedback to the governments and to the negotiators on what is happening with them when it comes to the AFCFTA dealing with the goods restrictiveness, whether it is removing those non-tariff barriers, whether it is facilitating investments to happen within the continent, and whether services are flowing. So this is another thing that we are building because we want the voice of the private sector to be able to feed back to the negotiators, or even when ministers meet as a council of ministers, we would want them to hear the voice of the private sector in terms of what the AFCFTA is delivering. Now, so we can have another conversation on some of the dimensions of this country business index, but the way it is constructed is such that it will be focusing on the private sector and ensuring that their voice is heard as we implement the AFCFTA. Now, the other thing is that there is this special focus we are having, of course, on gender. And again, as you may have heard since last year, the AFCFTA Secretary General, and of course the African leadership, they indicated they are going to have an additional protocol within the AFCFTA on women in trade and youth protocol. Now, so as ECA, we are working very hard to make sure that we harness the women and the young people so that their voice is heard, because we do want to believe that it is possible to implement this agreement. And rather than ensuring that there is an equal sharing of the benefits, you create a situation whereby some of the gaps that we see today, gender gaps in terms of incomes, in terms of earnings that we see today, rather than them being closed, they are expanded. So one of the things we are doing is to make sure that as we engage with countries, we make sure that the strategies that they come up with, they are not going to propagate the gaps that we see today, but rather they are going to grow the participation of the women and also the closing of some of the gaps, basically by ensuring that everybody is able to move into the higher value chains that the AFCFTA is going to foster. And that would also include dealing with some of the non-tariff barriers that are very specific to affecting the capacity of young people and women to be able to optimize on their businesses. So this is how we are looking at the issue of ensuring that everybody is on board. And this is because a lot of the businesses in the continent are owned by women, they are young, our population is young, and many of them are SMEs. Now, and I will not talk a lot about this, but we are using the approach of gender mainstreaming and women economic empowerment, which of course, as we know, Canada is very strong in this, so we are benefiting a lot from the experience and from the knowledge of this. In the way we are ensuring that there is mainstreaming of gender in the strategies, we are training our own staff, we are training most of the stakeholders within that are working on the AFCFTA, and we believe that by so doing, it will be possible for us to have outcomes 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line that place the continent in a better place today in terms of inclusivity, and we want to see the AFCFTA accelerating that process. And I know I don't have much time, so let me talk to the last slide. Now, this is not something that the AFCFTA negotiators have been mandated to do. They have not been mandated to negotiate a protocol on the environmental issues within the AFCFTA. But all of us believe and we know that we are living in a world where climate change is a serious issue. And we also we know that even as our economies restructure and as we move out of this pandemic, it is not going to be business as usual. The whole question of decarbonization is going to be critical. The whole issue of the kind of supply chains that are going to exist is going to be important. So what we have done under the ATPC is actually to start a new work program on the linkage between trade and the environment in the context of the AFCFTA. And we believe as a think tank, we will be able to be ready with useful information when the negotiators now start looking at these issues, or when countries start asking how do we integrate these environmental issues in our strategies, we will be ready with the information. So we are going to do research, we are going to do capacity building, we are going to provide technical assistance, we are going to work very closely with the African Regional Standards Organization, because some of these standards are critical to the issues of SPS and TBTs, and we'll continue with our advocacy. And we believe that by so doing, the AFCFTA, it is not going to be an agreement that leads to sustainable production and consumption, but one that leads to sustainable production and consumption. So I see you want me to stop now because I can go on and on. So thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. And we invite you certainly to go on. We've got our 30-minute Q&A session. So many questions coming through already. For those who don't use the WhatsApp line, a reminder that you can use that too to reach out in addition to the chat. But thank you for such a comprehensive outlay, which I think is such a perfect way to move forward to the next presenter. Fred McMahon joining us today from Toronto. And Fred at the Fraser Institute has really led arguably one of the most impactful indices that measures economic freedom, with trade as a central component. Dozens of think tanks across Canada and Africa are members of the Economic Freedom Network, which Fred oversees. And Fred, a very, very good morning to you. Canada is a free trade nation, as was just mentioned by MP Rob Oliphant, and you have got all of the data that backs that up, but says that in fact free trade is a component of prosperity anywhere. Here's how we measure it, and here's how we can move forward. So Fred McMahon, over to you. And Fred, we do see your slides, but I think you may be muted because we're not hearing you just yet.
Got it. Because the slides were up, I couldn't quite figure out how to get back to the on mute button. Thank you very much, Gareth, for inviting me here. You have done an incredible job leading the Canada-Africa Chamber of Commerce. I'd also like to compliment the Government of Canada for its role here. I noticed a couple participants, John Mugabe, who I have long worked with, and a group from Burundi supporting free trade. I was in Burundi just before COVID hit, and I had a marvelous time there working with the Enterprise Development Enterprise Association of the Great Lakes. I'm going to, and let me just mention, I was very impressed by Stephen's presentation, because getting the policy right is what makes free trade agreements work and what bring benefits to people. And I think the emphasis there was spot on. So I'm going to look at trade and policy. First, I'll discuss the policy measure that I use. Then we'll look at African and global trade patterns. And then Africa trade compared to other global regions. And finally, policy and results globally, and policy and results for Africa. As I mentioned to Gareth when he invited me and I started to research this, I found a great dichotomy between patterns in Africa and patterns elsewhere. So hopefully this trade agreement will be a major step in moving Africa to more beneficial results from trade. Policy measure I'm going to use is, as Gareth mentioned, the Economic Freedom of the World Index, which is basically a policy description of an economy. We call it economic freedom. You could also call it a measure of free markets and openness. As Gareth mentioned, it's become one of the most used indexes in the world. Over 1,000 academic and policy articles have used the index, including in the most prestigious economic publications like the American Economic Review. We look at economic freedom in 5 areas: size of government and taxation. Obviously, over big government can limit your economic freedom. Private property and the rule of law, almost certainly the most important aspect of freedom, in that it's needed to ensure that the freedom of everyone is protected. Sound money, and of course, what we'll be looking at today, trade regulation and tariffs. First, just let me emphasize or re-emphasize some of the things that Gareth, Rob, and Stephen have said, and that is about the importance of trade. Without trade, other aspects of economic reform are much weaker, because trade is needed and the competition that comes from trade is needed to move companies up into world-class competitors. Trade deals can and often do lead to other reforms, because as Stephen was saying, it's other reforms are often part of the trade package to ensure that all nations get fair treatment. Unfortunately, backsliding can become a problem. This has been demonstrated not precisely in trade, but in other areas by the EU, where once a country joins, they begin to slip in their international agreements. And finally, just a warning from South America: don't turn a free trade agreement into a closed door agreement. Unfortunately, both of the major trade agreements in South South America, Mercosur and the Andean. Mercosur started well, but became a protection area, and Andes is doing something of the same. So it's very important to have a free trade agreement regionally, but one that is actually open to the world as well. Freedom to trade. Africa, unfortunately, has been a global exception. Again, hopefully this trade agreement and others will change that. So this is a chart that I updated from a World Bank report on the benefits of free trade. You have GDP per capita on the left axis and trade as a percent of GDP on the right axis. And what you see is an extraordinary match between the two. It's simply a correlation, but the research shows, and I'm going to be using a number of simple charts, but let me say that while these charts typically show correlation, they are all backed by very sophisticated empirical research. Let me just point one curious thing. There have been a lot of ups and downs in trade as a percentage of GDP, but it started declining here, and this is well before COVID and well after the financial crisis here. So whether this decline is just another bump like this one, or if something special is happening that will mute trade in the future, is unclear at this moment. But it is a warning sign. Of course, here you get the COVID effect, but as I mentioned, it took place long before the COVID effect. So remember those two lines, and here's what happens with Africa. Africa actually started with about the same level of trade as it has now, but as you can see, unlike where in the rest of the world where increased trade pulled up GDP, African GDP remained low and lagging. And here the four lines are seen together. So you can see that since the early 1980s, the pattern between Africa and the world in merchandise trade is actually fairly similar, but the pattern in economic growth is very different. Now, a large part of that reason is because of the different composition of exports from Africa, which Stephen mentioned. Now, you'll see the data is actually broken, which is why I couldn't adjust the full series, and I'm showing you this separately. But while world trade, the resource percent of exports typically fluctuates between 10 and 20%, but basically averages about 15%. However, in recent years, the resource percentage of African exports has been 50%. And there are many, many different economic and social mechanics between non-resource exports and resource exports. So I'm going to look at trade policy as measured by the Fraser Institute. The measurement is on a 0 to 10 scale. It goes back to 1970, but prior to 2000, we have only data points every 5 years. So this is what happened with East Asia. You'll see there was a considerable growth in trade freedom between 1970 and 2000 for all regions. Eastern Europe, of course, that's the escape from communism in part being shown there. Latin America, MENA, and unfortunately, you'll see trade openness has actually declined since the Arab Spring. North America started off very, very high, but despite our North American free trade agreement, we've declined somewhat. That's Canada and the United States and Mexico. South Asia has moved up. Western Europe, in part because the EU is now at a very high level. And unfortunately, that is Africa, a lagger in open free trade policy. Now slightly ahead of MENA, but only because of MENA's decline. Hopefully, again, this agreement will help move Africa further up to higher levels of good policy. This is just a focus since 2000. I'm not going to spend time on it. This is economic freedom, which would be a measure of overall economic policy. And again, unfortunately, Africa and MENA are at the bottom. It is important to emphasize, just to pause, how much an agreement like the one being discussed today can go to improve not just trade policy, but overall economic policy. Reflections on the obvious. You often hear about how awful free trade and open markets are, how they impoverish people or whatever. I'm going to say some things that everybody, I think, in this meeting knows and understands, but the magnitude may not be as well known, because the magnitude of the gains from open markets and free trade are huge. First, we'll take a global look and then a focus on Africa. So again, you hear that free trade creates poverty. Well, the era of free trade globally is post-Second World War. So let's say we start at 1950. So here's what's happened to global poverty, desperate poverty, $1.90 a day in equivalent currency. And what has happened is, between 1950 and today, global poverty has been cut by about 2/3. That's a remarkable achievement. But look what happens when you compare that to the global population. So before the era really took effect of free trade and open markets, 3 in 4 people on the planet lived in desperate poverty. Today, only about 1 in 10 do. And those benefits have mostly accrued to nations with open markets and economic freedom. So if you look at the far left of this chart, the blue columns represent trade policy freedom. The yellow columns represent overall economic policy and openness. In nations that are least free globally, about 30% of the population still lives in desperate poverty. And that has almost completely disappeared in the most free nations, the most open nations. And one other thing you'll note is how closely trade policy is one aspect of overall economic policy, how closely the impact of trade policy follows the impact of overall economic policy. They tend to move together. This is the purchasing power parity adjusted income of the poorest 10%. Here, overall economic policy seems to do a little bit better, but there's very close. So if you're one of the poorest 10% in the most economically free nations in the world, you have an average income of about $14,000. That's higher than the average income. The poorest 10% in economically free nations have an income that's higher than the average income of everyone in Africa. It's a little bit less for free trade, but as you can see, again, a very close inquiry. This is what has happened to global per capita income, again, inflation adjusted, and it's risen immensely in the era of open markets and free trade. And again, very much concentrated in nations that have strong economic policy and open markets. So in the most free nations and in the most free trade nations, the average per capita GDP is around $50,000 per year, 45,000 for the most free overall. And when and that's about 10 times the average per capita GDP in the least free nations. Literacy, very similar pattern to what you saw with global poverty. Not only have the number of literate people globally shrunk considerably, they are now a much, much lower proportion of the population. Again, here I'm only looking at overall economic freedom because I already have 2 columns, and adding another 2 columns for free trade would clutter up the chart. But again, you can see not only is literacy much, much higher in economically free nations, the difference between boys and girls, men and women, virtually disappears in economically free nations. There's a dynamic here. When people can make their own way, when their own talents count, whether they're male or female, there's a much greater incentive to improve on education. Life expectancy years, same pattern, and same pattern for trade and overall economic freedom. I've gone through this, so I'm not going to spend any time on this slide. Last couple things. Economic freedom is very much associated with political rights and civil rights, because what economic freedom does is it liberates individuals from dependence either on governments or powerful elites to make their own ways, to push for democracy, to protect their own civil rights and freedoms. And this is my favorite chart. People who claim, opponents of economic freedom and free trade will sometimes even give up on the argument that economic freedom does not produce more prosperity. It's so obvious, but they say, well, we don't really care about prosperity. What we care about is human happiness. And a lot of research has been done on this. And what you'll see is in the most free nations, the level of human happiness is much higher. I think I've inverted this chart. These are the most free nations. As it turns out, people simply like to be in charge of their own lives, and that increases life satisfaction or happiness, which are used interchangeably in the literature. The African patterns differ from global ones. The signal from policy to result, which is very strong globally, is muddied by several factors in Africa. Internal and external difficulties trouble many nations. African trade is dominated by resource exports. The economic social dynamics of resource and non-resource trade are very different. Empirical research shows that there actually is a resource curse in nations with weak institutions, weak rule of law. However, resources benefit in nations with strong institutions like Botswana or Norway or Canada for that matter. So this is a chart you've seen before, which clearly shows a strong relationship between level of poverty and both economic freedom and freedom to trade. That relationship really doesn't show up in Africa. Now, the yellow bars are for nations that have resources, where resources are less than 10% of exports, and the deep blue is all African nations. And as you can see, there's really not much of a pattern there. Well, the most free quartile has the lowest percent of people living in absolute of absolute poverty, but the pattern is weak. This is income of poorest people. Now, this is going to look quite startling for a moment because of the great difference between the most free quartile amongst limited resources, but that's because the most free quartile, that's because there are only 7 nations. There are only 28 nations overall in this group, and thus only 7 per. And the most free quartile contains Botswana and Mauritius and South Africa that have relatively high incomes, same pattern for GDP. Life expectancy for limited resource nations, it does follow the global pattern, but again, it's disrupted. Happiness, again, disrupted. So my time is almost up. In fact, I may have gone a couple minutes over, with apologies, Gareth. Trade policy and openings bring in considerable benefits to people. Africa has not benefited as much as it should have. The Continental Free Trade Agreement is a promising move to enable Africans to experience the multiple benefits of free trade. And Gareth, with you and this incredibly distinguished panel, I see a huge amount of hope. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much for taking us through all of those slides. And the final remarks on this panel go to Sebastian Spiergarber, a special envoy of the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business to the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, joining us from Accra. Sebastian, thank you very much. Floor is yours.
No, thank you so much. Thanks for the very wonderful presentations. I have to apologize that I would have to leave the panel halfway through for some pressing matter, which unfortunately would interrupt the rest of this program. But I think one thing that I would like to draw attention to is that while at the technical level and at the strategic level, Africa is clearly moving to integrate its economies, at the political and security level, in the last few months, you've seen a series of military coups in Mali, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso, last night in Guinea-Bissau. And I think that in a certain sense, we shouldn't not reflect on those things, and to the extent that if this integration, which is a historic opportunity, doesn't happen fast enough and doesn't happen on an accelerated basis, you might have a situation much like in the 1960s, where in the post-colonial period, the whole continent started to unravel into different blocks. For instance, in West Africa, all these countries that have had military coups have been sacked, have been suspended from ECOWAS, from the African Union. So it's like you're building a house of 55 nations, and before even you could finish the first floor, you've ejected 5 members. And these 5 members are some of the largest countries. I mean, by land mass, if you add Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, we are looking at huge swaths of territory. So I do think that in a certain sense, in my judgment, from the little work we've been able to do here at the Secretariat, I believe that we have to do everything we can to accelerate the process of the integration and to be able to bring these economic benefits that the Fraser Institute has clearly outlined to people, because I think the vast majority of people are supporting these schools in the streets because, frankly, they don't see the difference between a military officer wearing a beret and carrying a gun and a civilian who is voting in parliament as a parliamentarian, but who is not providing for the people. So that's really the contribution I wanted to make, that I think, you know, in each of our areas, in each of our different ways in which we touch upon this subject, we all have to do more to accelerate this integration, because frankly, the political facts on the ground are beginning to move in the opposite direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, and thank you for your great work at the Secretariat, the opening of the office in Accra, and some of the papers that have recently come about. I'm going to move into the Q&A session, if I may. The first question actually relates to a paper that came from the Chamber's trade fellow, Akinyu Urilia. And the question goes to you, Dr. Kuringi. What is happening in terms of mechanisms, specifically EC-DPM mechanisms, that ensure individual companies can be compensated for trade barriers? Is this something that you foresee may happen? It was a recommendation of a paper that was done for the Chamber by one of our research fellows. That on that issue, if you have any comments, that would be fantastic. Fred, based on your work on the continent, would you just take a moment for those who haven't had the privilege of working with you to run through some of those workshops and how you go about working with individual leaders on the continent? We've heard a lot about what the government is doing at a government-to-government and multilateral level, but of course, Canadian civil society is often at the forefront doing enormous work. So if you could speak to that and how you work with independent civil society actors, I think that would be brilliant. And then Sebastian has had to leave, but if he does join us again, we will come back to a couple of questions, but a lot of comments elicited on the issue of military coups. So thanks for everyone commenting. Dr. Kuringi, first question to you, sir.
Actually, I did not get the question clearly.
Sure.
Is it something done by EC-DPM or what?
It goes to some recommendations around compensation for artificial trade barriers, that effectively, if trade barriers remain in place unfairly or inconsistently with the agreement, do you have any comments on the proposition that individual companies should be compensated for losses as a result of trade barriers that exist, which shouldn't be there, which are inconsistent with AFCTFA?
Okay.
Yeah,
now,
sorry about that. I should have gone
no,
through that.
But I mean, the whole idea of the AFCFTA, just like all trade agreements, is to create rules for trade. And so besides the tariffs that are going to come down, and which of course we know there's a dispute settlement mechanism within the AFCFTA to deal with some of these things. But I haven't had a situation whereby if it's almost like in the bilateral investment treaties, whereby you can take a government to court because of not meeting particular obligations. I hear that question being whether the obligations to facilitate free trade should be the basis for sanctions against the government, because who is going to compensate the private sector? So what the agreement does is it is going to have an anti-tariff barrier mechanism where you can report the NTB. And then, of course, once it's reported, it's up to the state parties to make sure that the government concerned removes that NTB. But I don't know, and I've not heard of any conversations of compensation for the private actor, so to speak, that is unable to trade. But maybe it's an issue for further investigation, or maybe I've not read enough of how other regions are dealing with this.
No, thanks very much, Dr. Kuringi. Perfect. Fred, the question of your work and how specifically you're working with civil society groups or have on issues of free trade in the context of economic freedom.
Well, thank you for asking. First, let me say, like you, I've now been watching the chat and the concern with instability and violence is powerfully expressed. And that's a key reason, not the only one, but a key reason why Africa has diverged in results from the rest of the world. And I'm glad to see that focus on it, as well as the great work you're doing. The Economic Freedom Index itself, as Nobel laureate Douglas North has noted, is probably the best single overall description of an open economy. We use 42 separate variables to get a broad-ranging prescription. What we do with local partners, and I've worked with local partners in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Burundi, and South Africa. I may be missing something, excuse me if I have. What we do with local partners is use the index to develop an overall policy description of a particular government, and then work with the think tank in a series of seminars with local leaders or national leaders to develop a new set of policy reforms that will help move the nation forward. It's a very exciting process. We've done 24 globally, and as I mentioned, several in Africa.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Fred. Many comments coming through. Thank you so much. I'm going to just go ahead to more of the questions specifically, and perhaps we can come into some discussion on comments. On the question of infrastructure, Amadou Barry, who, greetings, is on the bar in both Quebec and as a lawyer in Guinea, has asked around the issue of a lack of cross-border infrastructure. Dr. Karingi, I know you did answer it in the chat, but I wouldn't mind some people who are joining us by phone at the moment or on the road, I think would love to hear that response from you. And then Fred, in terms of market solutions, the PPPs, any thoughts on the infrastructure question in terms of the experience of the Fraser Institute on how we fill that gap? Because, you know, often there's an assumption it may be solely government. Do you have any contrary thoughts in terms of that provision of infrastructure? Dr. Karingi.
No, thanks, Gareth. So what I have said in the chat is that there is the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, PIDA, which has priority action plan or priority action projects, so to speak, that are aimed at connectivity within the continent. There is no project at the PIDA that does not connect two countries. It could be road, rail, or energy. So that is going to create the environment. Then the second point, the other point I have said in the chat is that AFCFTA is actually going to create an environment for broader private sector. So domestic resources are going to grow, and those are going to help in creating the infrastructure, or rather deepening the infrastructure development. So the numbers that I gave in terms of the number of trucks that will be required, the wagons, all those will need infrastructure, and in themselves, basically offer an opportunity for a strong return on investment, both in terms of public investments and also public-private partnerships. If I may, Gareth, there's somebody who has asked a specific question on the intellectual property rights. Just to say, the conversations have started. The modalities have actually been, for the negotiations have been agreed. And the negotiations now will start now that the modalities have been agreed on how to go about it. And then the idea is to finalize this sometimes by June 2023, if not earlier.
Thank you very much, Dr. Karingi. Excellent.
Our index doesn't measure infrastructure directly because we look at policy. And in fact, good policy does tend to lead to building infrastructure, in part because it's a chicken and egg question. If you build infrastructure and nobody is using it, it tends to fall apart. And that's been a problem in Africa. If you build infrastructure and people are using it, it's very useful. Again, another good reason for for expecting benefits from the free trade agreement, then it will be more durable. So you have to have both the infrastructure and the trade at the same time. Last comment, I've done some research, now this is a few years old, on the impact of government spending. And the only aspect of government spending where there was a clear, unambiguous relationship between spending and growth, a positive relationship between spending and growth, was on infrastructure, and specifically transportation infrastructure. So what Stephen was just saying about moving that forward is tremendously important.
Thanks very much, Fred. I'll go reverse the order and put the first question to you, Fred, and then the second to you, Stephen. The issue of coups has come up, the issue of human rights, a lot of very important points made on the chat. Dr. El Kazin over in Ottawa making some extensive comments. John Mugabe asked the question, how best can AFCTFA protect business from, quote, the ego and arrogance of state actors? And I think you touched on some of the prerequisites for free trade, Fred. How do some of those prerequisites, enable and secure freedom and stability more broadly? So your thoughts in that regard would be welcomed on that relationship. And then Dr. Karingi, going back to remarks from the government of Canada and your own remarks on the relationship and what the people of Canada have done to date, a question from policymakers here in Canada: how can the country continue in partnership to best support implementation of this agreement in the way that's been done to date with this first stage, or at least the earlier stages? So your thoughts there on furthering the relationship would be brilliant. Fred, first question to you.
Sure. Hello, John, and thanks for the question. My answer is not going to be very pleasing because this is the toughest possible thing to do. We have done research globally, not just in Africa, globally, but on the rule of law, which is really what John is getting at, because the rule of law is needed to restrain the arrogance and greed of government officials. When we look at the rule of law, what we find is, in an econometric term, it's a stationary point. What that means is if the rule of law is here and you get a good government that pushes it up to here, it tends to revert back. And same thing if with a bad government, it tends to revert back. So all I can say is that this is a government can on Wednesday pass a tax cut that will take place on Thursday morning. If a government on Wednesday afternoon declares that all judges and policemen will be honest, it's not likely that they will all suddenly be honest on Thursday morning. It's a long, long struggle, and it's one not of months, but of years, even decades. It can be done. Some nations have done it. It's not a zero possibility, but it is long and difficult.
Thank you very much, Fred. Dr. Karingi, on the relationship with Canada on the free trade area going forward.
No, I think I would want first of all to weigh in on this question of
Sure.
trade, and just to say that when you have an agreement like the AFCFTA and you have countries and the private sector benefiting from it, you have young people, you have women, small businesses seeing the benefits of this, it actually raises the stakes of political instability or conflict. So AFCFTA has actually an opportunity to deal with these issues of peace and security and conflict within the continent, especially once people start seeing the benefits of it, and if it raises all the boats at the same rate. So which then brings me to the second question: how can Canada continue to support this process? I think I would say the first point of entry is actually to support countries in the implementation, because the AFCFTA at the end of the day, it's an agreement between state parties, and those state parties happen to be countries. Now, we've been working very hard as ECA with the support from, and of course, working with the SG Wamkele's team and other people that are supporting the Secretariat to do national strategies and also ensure that there is that implementation focus. Now, once those strategies come into play, countries will have to finance those strategies. They will have to undertake reforms. They have to codify their law for those strategies and the rules under the AFCFTA. And some of them will require some resources. Some of them will require further dialogue. So we need to have more engagement at the country level. Ask the question, how are you doing, Ethiopia, in terms of implementing the AFCFTA? Which are the sectors that you would want to see attraction of FDI, or you would want to see accelerated? So these are some of the things. So that friendship of Canada should start there, and I believe it's always there because most of these relationships are bilateral. But then, of course, you have to strengthen. We have to keep supporting the institutions like the AFCFTA Secretariat, because it's a consequential institution for the continent. It's an important institution for this continent, just like the WTO has been an important institution for global trade. So if we can do this, and supporting the AFCFTA Secretariat is both direct and indirect. And so basically, that's another way that Canada can continue engaging with the African people and the African businesses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Some comments in the chat relating to Asian tigers, because it's come up more than once. Two issues that have been raised. One is that they achieve success and prosperity despite access to significant trade platforms. The other is that there's not necessarily a correlation between the rate of human rights and democratic institutions and the broader economic prosperity. Fred, I wonder if I could hand that over to you to unpack any comments you have in terms of what the data says in that regard. And Dr. Karingi, if your thoughts on a comparison like that with the Asian tiger nations.
Yeah, they very much weren't democracies when they started off, but they adopted they had a good rule of law, and they adopted a pattern of trade openness to the rest of the world. Globalization, as you know today, was already well in development at their time, though not as much as it is today. And there's every reason to believe that trade openness and free markets was one of the key factors in moving these nations towards democracy and freedom. Remember, Taiwan grew out of a brutal dictatorship that had been defeated by Chairman Mao. They fled to Taiwan. It was a complete disaster. And as they opened up to trade in the world, their freedom started growing as well, because people were no longer dependent on powerful government actors to make their own way. Other centers of power begin to develop. Very similar in South Korea as well. Horrible civil war, very brutal dictatorship, some political instability, including the assassination of both the president and his wife. But the popular pressure for democracy eventually transformed that nation. There is a strong, strong global connection between open markets and democracy. When you look around the world, it is very, very difficult. You can't really find a nation with a stable democracy that does not have free and open markets. And almost every nation that does not have open markets is some form of dictatorship. I mean, the relationship is there to see, and the dynamics about liberating people from independence have been well established.
Excellent. Dr. Karingi, over to you, sir.
Well, the point I would want to make on this is that it's very unlikely to have revolutions where you have where you don't have deep inequalities. I don't know, maybe Fred can talk about this because he has more data than, but basically what I want to say is that if you have a situation whereby you have people included, and people can see the value of this mega regional trade agreement, because that's what one could call it, then it's unlikely, and that is creating equality rather than deepening inequality, then you don't have these revolutions. But if you have pockets of very rich people, because those businesses are taking all their shareholders, and then the people who are doing the production at a particular level of the value chain are not feeling the benefit. And of course, you have these kind of challenges. So the AFCFTA should also be seen as a platform for not only for reducing poverty, but also addressing the question of inequality that we see in a good number of our states. But having said that, I also want to say that our markets, our economies are very small. I mean, if you look at the average size of an economy in the continent, some of them could even be counties in Canada. And so there is every reason why we need to have one market under the AfCFTA. And we also know that even the smallest economies, including where you could even be seeing conflict, they benefit the most from free trade. It is not true that it is the largest economy like South Africa that will benefit the most from the AfCFTA, but even the smallest and the weakest among us within the continent, based on our international experience, they tend to benefit the most from an agreement like this if it is done right. And I think the AfCFTA, the continent is doing it right.
Thank you, Dr. Kurungi. Yes, Fred, go ahead.
Yeah, Stephen, a very good point, and I agree with you. And that has actually been a shift in thinking on the free market side of things. What we used to argue, and still argue, is that the key thing is poverty. And if some people get a little bit richer faster, it's less important than pulling people out of poverty. We've now begun to understand that large levels of inequality, even if you reduce poverty a great deal, large levels of inequality lead to resentment and instability. Now, everybody's still working on the policies that actually reduce inequality without reducing economic output, but we now recognize it. I mean, we all know of the famous experiment with the chimpanzee, where a chimpanzee is very, very happy if you give it a slice of lemon, but has a huge temper tantrum if he sees another chimp getting a grape. And we're like that. So even if our lives are improving, if the rich are getting a whole bunch of grapes and we're only getting melons, we become unhappy. So we need to address the very question you raised, because inequality is clearly destabilizing.
Thank you very much, Fred. A number of comments still coming through. I'm going to invite each of you to address any of the outstanding comments or questions or points you wish to make in a final round now before we hand over to Vice President Susan Namolindwa for concluding remarks. Some of those comments include, let's keep perspective on instability. Ken McGee has done a comparison on recent events. Issue of fragility. Dr. Al-Kazin has mentioned that. Fred, perhaps if you have more points speaking to that question under the rule of law, please feel free to do so. I know you've touched on that rule of law earlier on in your presentation. And then everyone just as said, we're pro-democracy. So some of those questions were really the devil's advocate questions, but of course, very important considerations because they do frequently come up, as Victoria Shaw pointed out, as counter-arguments. So the floor is essentially open to each of you. Dr. Kurungi, if I may, I will allow you to offer any thoughts on any of these issues or just simply concluding remarks, whatever you see as the biggest priority and takeaway for us as we leave this event and go forward in our respective professions on this issue of Canada-Africa free trade in the context of ensuring the AfCFTA works and thrives and flourishes.
So very briefly, another question from Victoria, that African states finance their budget with trade taxation. What is our recommendation? So I was going to say that, interestingly, Victoria, and I don't know, we don't have the time for me to do a back of the envelope demonstration for you that this is not a big issue. Just to say that because of trade creation, just the standard international trade theory, because of trade creation, we expect there will be more business, there will be more incomes because of employment, and this is going to be more than enough to compensate for the losses because of reducing tariffs. But having said that, Afreximbank has been very generous. It has put on the table an adjustment facility that will help countries that find it a challenge to meet their commitments under the tariff face down, so that at least they can get some money from Afreximbank to deal with that, the adjustment that comes with that. But as an economist, I believe that there will be many times over in terms of incomes and revenues for countries after they reduce the tariffs and we start seeing businesses grow within the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Dr. Karingi. And to close us off on your side, Fred McMahon for final comments.
This is a hugely promising start, and it may be a break from the past because trade does encourage the development of good institutions. But let me say, hard work, dedication, and clear-sightedness is required. With apologies, I'll tell a small story. I was sitting in the office of the head of the development for one of the Gulf states, who was actually a friend and worked with Fraser Institute on promoting economic freedom globally. And I said, Solomon, this one window regulation shop sounds very good, but what exporters and businesses are saying is that behind that one window are all the other windows that used to exist. And all that happens is you put the piece of paper through one window and then it circulates all through the bureaucratic junk that it used to. Now, as I mentioned, Solomon was a friend. I've never seen him angry, but I was told he could have a temper tantrum, and boy, did he. He started screaming at me about how this couldn't be true. This was just false. His main assistant was sitting next to me, and it looked like she was trying to become part of the coach. And finally, when Solomon finishes, he slams his hand down on the desk and says, "Where did you get this awful false stuff?" And I slid a piece of paper across the desk to him and said, "Solomon, this is a report from your own organization that says this." So it is, he calmed down. So it's very, very important to understand the challenges and be open to them so that you can meet them. Once again, Gareth, thank you very much. Stephen, I learned a lot from you, and Susan, I'm looking forward to your closing remarks. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Fred McMahon, Dr. Stephen Karingi. An absolute privilege to have moderated this session over the past 90 minutes. And of course, to Global Affairs Canada and the Government of Canada, including members of Parliament like MP Rob Oliphant, who kicked us off, Sebastian Spiergarber, other directors, board members of the Chamber. I know Paula Caldwell is on this call, former Director General for Africa at Global Affairs and Vice Chair of the Chamber. Other board members too. It's an absolute privilege to have moderated this session. Without further ado, for the official closing, I'm pleased to hand over to my friend and colleague on the continent this morning and this afternoon, Susan Namolindwa. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Gareth, and thank you so much to our panelists. I have learned so much today, and for me, I find it an absolute pleasure that we were having this conversation when I'm on the continent for the first time during the pandemic. And it puts in place why this conversation is important. So I'll give you a quick example. I'm in Kampala today, and this week, since today's Wednesday, since this week, we've had news about borders. We've opened the border with Rwanda that has been closed for over 2 years. We have on the other side the border with Kenya where trucks are stuck, not like the trucks in Ottawa, but they are trying to move goods through, but they are stuck. And this has great impact. And I'm doing a trade tour, not tour, but a trade visit on the continent. I'm talking to cashew nuts producers in Nairobi and macadamia nut producers in Nairobi, cashew nut producers in Tanzania, and juice producers in Uganda that don't know that there's this great market around them. And they're talking to me and they're saying, we want to export to Canada and all that. I'm going, we don't have the standard, you don't have the standards yet or the capacity to do that. But look, you have a market around you. 1.3 billion people, but then there's all these other pieces that we need to put in place. Because listening to Dr. Karingi, intracontinental trade is so vital. And it is right here for us. But with the border challenges and all that, and there's so This is where Canada as a trusted partner can come in. So for me, as I'm listening to Fred and Stephen speak, I'm going, oh, I was so tempted to put my hand up. I'm like, no, we need to hear from them. But there's a couple of other things on top of what you have said that I think we can bring to bear. And I know that our partners at Global Affairs are still on, and this recording will also be available. But Canada has an opportunity. The feminist, I cannot talk about this and not bring in that experience that Canada has around the feminist international trade policy. This is an opportunity for Canada to help, not only to help, but to build capacity of the policy around women and inclusive trade and informal sector, because that is really what is going to make those changes that we need. There is the issue of border crossings and tariffs. Canada can really do this. And the biggest component is Canadian companies can really benefit, as we have seen from the pandemic. Canadian businesses can benefit by doing those collaborative pieces with the African companies, where it's not so much, it is trade, but also building capacity, because capacity is going to be what really builds us. And when you add on the information that we have gotten from you, Fred and Stephen, I mean, this was so rich, and we are so appreciative that you took the time to do that. And thank you to our audience as well. I was, the activity on the chat has been incredible, and I think this should be, Gareth, I know you got us. We need to have part 2 and part 3, because there's so many pieces that we raised or were raised that we have not really been able to unpack fully. And to our audience across the continent and in Canada and the rest of the world, this information is going to be available, and we are always available at the chamber. I'm going to say Gareth more than all of us combined, but he leads a strong team, and we are always available to answer any lingering questions. And thank you so much. Please stay in touch. The recordings are going to be available at 2 p.m. by 2 p.m. Eastern today. Reach out, and Fred and Stephen, I'm sure will be happy to answer any lingering questions that have not been tapped on today. We thank you so much for joining us this morning, this afternoon, this evening. Have a wonderful rest of your day.